What's up everyone, I'm Sublight Drive, and today I've got a new project that you can build yourself. These are some ornamental sci-fi panels. A while back I made this guy as a project just for myself. It was a fun build, and I found it was a good way to explore some shapes and techniques without the stress of building a whole model. So if you've been thinking about scratch building some sci-fi stuff, but a big project feels daunting, I think this is a good way to get a handle for it in a more controlled setting. I also think that making these is just fun. Call it an arts and crafts project. I'll include a link below to where you can download the templates to build the same ones that I'm making here. While I upload this video, we're just about waist deep in the holiday season, so yes, I turned mine into Christmas tree ornaments. To get started building, I cut out all of the templates with just enough of a border to tape them down onto my styrene for cutting. I've got two different weights of styrene, one thicker for the base and a thinner one for the panels. That being said, you could do this with just about any flat, sturdy material. If you don't have styrene, even just plain cardboard or a heavy cardstock will work. If you wanted to scale things up to a larger size, foam core is a super versatile building material too. I had someone ask once if they could just tape the entire template down at once and cut out everything from there. Well, I suppose you could do that. What I think would happen is the more pieces that you cut out, the more the paper will begin to lose its structural integrity. And by the time you're halfway done, it'll be flopping all over while you try to cut. If you really want to cut everything all at once, you can do something like this. It works, but it turns out it's not the most efficient use of styrene. Once everything is cut out, I want to add more detail to the individual panels by adding panel lines. I'm going to use a little tungsten carbide tip Machinist Scribe to do this. I'm not really scribing the surface, more like indenting it, which leaves a nice smooth line. I haven't tried it, but I imagine you could also do this with a really small ball stylus, like for sculpting clay. I'd be curious to see if there's a different look to lines created by different tools. I sometimes find that if I pull the scribe all the way to the edge, it leaves little hangnails if I'm not careful. Fortunately, these are pretty easy to trim off just by dragging a blade along the edge. Next, I want to break up the sides of these individual panels with notches. I like to do this by hand, but apparently there's a metalworking tool called a nibbler that can do this super quick. The downside, if you consider it a downside, to that is that all of your notches will be the same size and shape. I like mine to have some variety to them, and I'm not exactly pressed for time on a project like this. If you were doing this on an industrial scale though, I imagine it would be super useful. Once the panels are all notched up, it's time to glue them in place. I do this in two steps, first with super glue in the centers. You might have noticed that while adding panel lines, the thin sheets tend to bow up like a potato chip. Super glue in the center keeps them from puffing up once they're glued down. Next, I outline them all with Weld On 3. This seals all the edges down, which will be important for later. The panels are all in place, but I want to add more surface detail. And to do that, I'm going to start with all these little styrene scraps that I actually kept when I was making the notches. To attach them, I'm going to get a nice fresh X-Acto blade, so the tip is super sharp. Then, all I need to do is just barely touch the little bits, and I can pick them up. Then I give them a little dip in the Weld On, and I can place them wherever I like. The last part of building is kitbashing. I've got a little drawer here full of the smaller bits that I've clipped but never used on older projects, and I think I'll find some good stuff in here. Tank wheels are my go-to, so I've grabbed a few of those, but I also have these little green bits of what I think was a tiny drill press. They look like little communications boxes to me, with antennas and buttons and such. So Some people really like to use wire, which I guess has its place, but I always find it to be a bit of a pain to bend and glue into the right shape. Instead, what I've got here are these styrene half-round rods. They're flat on one side, so they're real easy to glue down, and I like the way they look, like tubes embedded in the surface. The last step here is to drill a hole along the top for displaying these guys. To make sure that nothing comes apart because of the hole, I ran a little bit of Weld On along the inside to get it all nice and sealed. Now that all the details are in place, I'm going to hit everything with a gray primer and get to painting. My first step after the primer is to do some Aztecing. By that I mean masking off some little rectangular or geometric spots here and there to add some extra visual noise and create the impression that this is something that's been constructed in parts, just like the panel lines do. You could also mask off entire panel sections instead of making these little random shapes. I think the method I'm using creates a really heavy, industrial, Star Wars-y look, which I like. Next, I want to add some color. I'm not getting too exciting with the patterns here, just shapes that I think won't be too hard to make with the masking tape. I should say that while I'm doing all this painting with an airbrush, I'm not really using it to its full potential, which is to add soft gradients and smooth color blending. You can do everything I'm doing just as easily with a brush. I've gotten some very cool results by masking and then stippling on color with a cheap bristly one. To make the paint look worn and chipped away by space debris or what have you, I got a little bit of sponge that I tore at, and I'm just dabbing it on the same surface gray that I used earlier. There's no wrong way to do this, but I find that you get the best results by hitting corners and edges the hardest. It's a bit like picking out all the spots that would get hit by dry brushing and then doing this to those spots instead. Speaking of which, dry brushing would probably look pretty good on these. I didn't think to do it at the time though. Once I finished with chipping, I hit everything with a matte clear coat to seal off the acrylics, and then move on to oil paints. There's about a million different ways to use oil paints for weather. My go-to is to thin it down a whole bunch with mineral spirits, and then just let capillary action carry it along all those little tiny panel lines and edges. This is why sealing the edges of the panels earlier with Weld On was so important. If I hadn't, the paint would all just get sucked right under the panel and disappear. Getting the right ratio of paint to thinner can be tricky, and requires a lot of back and forth to get it flowing properly. There are pre-mixed panel liners out there that you can get, but I like the extra degree of control I have while hand mixing. The last step I'll do here is add some more color and streaking. I'll do this by dotting the whole thing all over with some different colors, brown and yellow this time. Once the dots are on, I get a brush wet with thinner and then just drag it all down in one direction. The final result ended up tinting everything a little bit brown, but I don't mind it so much. Oil paints take a while to dry, so if you want to pull back the color a bit, it's easy to do with a little bit more thinner and a clean cotton swab. Once the oil paint was dry, I found some paper clips to use as hangers, and I put them up on my tree. Alright, so this was kind of a silly project, I'll admit. But that being said, I had a lot of fun doing it. I think that the whole process of panelizing is just very zen. I might make a few more, just to try out all the stuff that I mentioned here, but never got around to actually trying it. If you want to make your own ornamental panels like mine, I'll have a link below to where you can buy a template for yourself. If you do make one, as always, I would love to see it. I don't often say it outright, but I do think of this channel as a way for me to help other people get into scratch building. It can be a daunting thing trying out a new hobby, which is why I think projects like this one are so important. It's an entry point. something that anyone can do and make something cool. So if you do make an ornament, or any of my projects, please share it. I'll have all my socials linked below in addition to my Etsy. Seeing what you guys do with my designs is totally my favorite part of just about everything I get to do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.